Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm Ryan Murdoch. For show notes, club member bonuses, and more conversations, go to personallandscapespodcast.com. I was obsessed with Easter Island as a teenager. I read every book about it in my small town public library and every English language book at my university. I even bought a topographic map with all the archaeological sites from World of Maps in Ottawa. All the books that I read said roughly the same thing, that a small, isolated group of people living in the world's most remote inhabited island couldn't have sculpted, moved, and erected the enormous statues that are Easter Island's most famous feature. Or if they had done so, they must have been consumed by some sort of monument-building obsession that led them to cut down all the trees, causing mass starvation and warfare, and destroying their own civilization in the process. Archaeologist Mike Pitts tells a very different and far more compelling story about this incredible place. He draws on a forgotten archive of interviews and excavations to build a picture of a remarkable cultural flourishing in a remote and unforgiving environment. His new book is one of my top reads of the year, and I couldn't wait to talk to him about it. Mike Pitts is the author of Island at the Edge of the World, The Forgotten History of Easter Island. We spoke about the small group of settlers who discovered Rapa Nui, the genesis of the famous ecocide myth, and what those massive stone statues really mean. This is the last episode of 2025, so thank you to everyone who listened to Personal Landscapes this year, and special thanks to those who supported it as club members. It's still going after 4 years because you signed on. I'll post an update on Substack about what to expect in 2026. Before we get started, a quick reminder that this podcast relies on the support of listeners like you, my club members, to keep going. The entire thing's a one-man show. I do it all myself, outside my day job, which is writing. But I can't keep funding an unpaid job using what I earn from paid work, and I won't in the new year. If you don't want Personal Landscapes to fade away like petroglyphs in the rain, then please consider joining my members club. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com to find out more. And now, here's my conversation about Easter Island with Mike Pitts. So when did you first become interested in Easter Island?
It was quite early on. I was fortunate to be in a really unusual situation at school where we had a classics teacher whose brother was a British Museum curator and who taught archaeology at the school, which was a really unusual exam to have at the time. And in fact, indeed, it no longer exists at schools at all in Britain. And not only did I learn about archaeology through this guy, who was really quite a charismatic teacher, and I really got into it, and I already had a bit of an interest. But he was also the school librarian. And of course, in the library was a whole bunch of archaeology books, which included Tor Heyerdahl's book, Aku Aku, which was his book about Easter Island. And there were two archaeology books I read at that time, which were in the school library. One of them was a book by a guy called Richard Atkinson about Stonehenge, which is in its own way an iconic Stonehenge book by an archaeologist who directed a lot of excavations at the monument in the middle of the last century. And the other was this Aku Aku by Tor Heyerdahl. And both books really excited me. They both had this sense of archaeology as a process of detection, of going out into the world and discovering stuff and finding things that nobody knew about and piecing all the bits together to make a narrative and coming out with new insights into the kind of the human story. And I just found that really exciting. And even then at the time, I also, with Tor Heyerdahl's book, I found some of the stuff in the book but unbelievable. I thought he's making this up, or there's something wrong here. I had this instinct for it. But anyway, so that was when I was at school, and years later, almost by complete accident, I ended up directing excavations at Stonehenge, and I got really involved with Stonehenge archaeology. And my most recent book one, was the Stonehenge book I've been thinking about writing for years, and I couldn't get an angle on exactly what I was going to say. And so many of my friends and colleagues, and of course archaeology is quite a small world, had written their own Stonehenge books, and I didn't want to just do the same thing. And then an idea came to me, and I wrote this book, which I'm really quite proud of, called How to Build Stonehenge. And then I thought, right, what next? Easter Island. But in the meantime, which we can talk about, I got to travel a lot. And I did go to Easter Island. I had actually when I was traveling, I was determined that I was never going to go there. I had this image that I got of the island from reading Hardall's book. And funny enough, I'd read very little else about the island since then, or seen any pictures or television films or anything. And it wasn't, up into the 80s and 90s, it wasn't a place where there was much said, really, outside the island, outside Chile. So I had this idea in my head, this romantic idea of Easter Island with all the statues and how amazing it would be. And I was absolutely convinced that if I went, that vision would be destroyed and I would be very disappointed. A common feature of traveling, really. You get an idea in your head, and when you get there, it just doesn't live up to expectations. So I didn't want to go there.
I had the exact same experience. That's funny because I read every book I could find about the topic in my small town library in Ontario. And then when I went to university, I raided their shelves, and I even bought this. I got a map. If you see,
yeah.
There was a shop in Ottawa called World of Maps, and they had this Easter Island map. So I obsessed over it for a long time. But the same thing, I thought once it got easier to go there, I don't know if I want to go anymore because you could take a flight, and it sounded a bit touristy, and I was worried I might destroy the vision that I had in my head. So it's funny that you had the same.
Yeah, it's quite a common. I mean, I think a lot of, I mentioned Stonehenge. I mean, a lot of people visiting Stonehenge for the first time are deeply disappointed by the experience.
I guess, yeah, you see a place so many times in photos that it's like you've been there already, and it never quite.
I was convinced that was what would happen if I went to Easter Island and said, right, I'm not going.
So most of my listeners will probably know where this is, but for those who don't, we should probably orient them geographically so we could give them a sense of its place in the world. Right.
Well, it's a Pacific island. It's one of the remotest Pacific islands, of which there are thousands. I mean, and the Pacific covers about a third of the planet. I mean, it's a hugely significant, vast area. It has an absolutely glorious human history. The Pacific was colonized by people coming from Asia in the West, beginning really as far back as 50, 60,000 years ago, when, although this is debatable, even now, some people say it was only 30 or 40,000 years ago that people first arrived in Australia and islands close by, and then gradually acquiring the skills to navigate over open seas and moving gradually further east and out into the Pacific through the islands. And eventually, at a time when Polynesian culture had developed in the Eastern Pacific, bursting out into the wider ocean, and within a few centuries, discovering islands as remote as Hawaii, New Zealand down to the southeast, and the other side of the ocean, Rapa Nui, the extreme west. But even then, Rapa Nui is thousands of miles from the nearest continent over at Chile and Peru. So it's an extremely remote island, and it's really small, and there's no habitable islands close by. And most of the islands across Polynesia, like Hawaii is a good example, are clusters of islands. And so they're almost like sort of marine continents in a way, that people are living on the land, but they're also effectively living on the sea. And they're traveling backwards and forwards between the islands, and different islands have different resources, different types of rock, different plants and so on, different ecologies. And different groups of people develop on different islands. And so there's communication between these different groups, and you get these cultures developing. And Easter Island is quite unlike that. It is literally on its own. And the impression we have is that once it was discovered around about 1200 in the Christian era, there was no real contact with the rest of Polynesia after that.
Was it just because of the distance? Was it because of the distance?
Yes. I mean, we don't know why. But one theory I've got is that actually one of the issues with Easter Island is it's partly because of its remoteness and its geology and its small size. It's ecologically, naturally, before people got there, it's ecologically impoverished relative compared to many other Pacific islands. And it's a bit further south than most Polynesian islands, so it's not as warm and tropical. And one of the plants that is absent on Rapa Nui that is very common across most of the Pacific is pandanus. And pandanus was used as a material to weave sails for ocean-going canoes in Polynesia. So one possibility is that actually once they arrived on the island and had been there for a bit, they were unable to make sails, at least of the scale and size that was required. But who knows? And another explanation that's often raised is the idea that there just weren't enough trees, that before long, most of the big trees had gone. And you need big trees to make big canoes. And the ocean-going canoes, I mean, the ships is really a better word. I mean, but they consist of two, Polynesian ocean-going canoes consist of two hulls, two parallel hulls, with a deck across them, and one or two huge sails. And they'd have a house on the deck with a fireplace, hearth in it. And of course, to colonize the Pacific, they'd be taking live animals with them, pigs and chickens and women and children and men and all sorts of artifacts and possessions and stuff. I mean, it's like a little village on the ocean, really.
So how many people would be sent off on one of these colonizing missions?
Well, we're largely guessing, because there's no historical evidence for this, because the colonization was all long happened by the time the first Europeans got into the Pacific and started recording things. But maybe 200 or 300 people, arriving in Rapa Nui on a couple, possibly 3 ocean-going canoes. I mean, it seems likely that any of these expeditions would have been done with at least 2 ships rather than just one, so that if you get into trouble, there's a backup, as it were. And the voyages would have been done they would have been extremely well planned and managed. These are incredibly skilled ocean-going voyages. I mean, the world's most accomplished and extraordinary achieving ocean explorers. I mean, they make the Vikings look like, guys in paddling pools, really. I mean, Vikings, had similar-sized ships. One single hull, of course, but Vikings had similar-sized ships to Polynesian ships, as did the ancient Greeks with the triremes. They're similar-sized ships. But the difference between Mediterranean shipping and Viking shipping on the one hand and Polynesian shipping on the other is that in Europe, these guys are basically sailing around the coast and up rivers. I mean, occasionally they cross the North Sea, they go out to the Vikings go out to Iceland and Greenland, and they cross a bit of ocean. But compared to what's happening in the Pacific, this is child's play. And these guys in the Pacific are making planned expeditions. They're incredibly skilled. The ships are wonderful crafts. And they go out with all sorts of food and water and supplies and kit and stuff. And they will plan a voyage that means that there will come a point when they've found no land. So they will go back. So they will, as it were, when they get halfway through their supplies, they will then turn back. And they know at least that there's a little bit of the ocean where there's nothing, and they'll go out again. So you get this sense that there has to be a phenomenal drive to do this, enormous determination, and what those reasons are, we can really only guess, but presumably it's, one would guess it's to do with growing populations, needing more land, because even the largest islands, they're not huge. Obviously there's a huge difference between an island civilization and a continental one in terms of land supply. And these communities are growing, and they're starting to, in some cases, they're starting to fight for land and resources. And they're developing quite strongly hierarchical communities where individuals are fighting for status and power. So there's likely to be a mix of kind of broad reasons like just the need for more land, and personal reasons like trying to escape people you've upset, or looking as a group of individuals looking to stake new territory where they can take control and empower themselves in a way that they're not able to where they're living. And it's the most extraordinary thing. And by the time it's finished, it was only a few centuries, but there's barely an island left in the Pacific that isn't colonized. And some of them are even smaller than Rapa Nui. And when Europeans first arrived, there were no people on these islands. But there's archaeological evidence that they had been discovered and people had lived there for a time. But for one reason or another, and somehow, we don't know how, of course, but the islands are abandoned, the communities died out. And Rapa Nui is one of these islands that's very much on the small end of the spectrum. So it's a remarkable achievement that, in fact, people, if nothing else, that people were still living on the island when the first Europeans saw it. that in itself was indication that these people had done extremely well. They'd managed, if you like, their land management was very skilled to succeed on such a small island that was ecologically so challenging for them.
So I think we should start with the commonly believed story of Easter Island. And you touched on the opposite of that just now, that they were skilled managers of their local ecology. But sketch out the commonly believed story, since that's what you set out to refute in your book. And that's what makes it so startling for somebody like me to read, who has read this ecocide story over and over again in all the books about it. So could you sketch that out for us in brief before we go on to demolish it?
Okay. When the first European or the first scientific expeditions arrived on the island from outside, and this was in a fairly brief period, there were 6 ships, and the first came from Britain. And there's one from Chile, a couple of France, one from Germany, and the last came from the United States, the USS Mohican. That was between 1868 and 1886, so it's a period of less than 2 decades. When those ships came to Rapa Nui, they saw an island that was absolutely covered in statues, hundreds and hundreds of them everywhere, absolutely enormous, far exceeding the number of people on the island. And in the middle of that period, 1877, the population of Rapa Nui was recorded at 110. And they also, as well as sort of being faced with this conundrum of how come such a tiny population was living on this island with all these hundreds and hundreds of huge statues, the island itself was bleak. There were no trees. There seemed to be very little food being grown. And so the impression was that there was something odd had happened on this island, and that the people who were living there, who couldn't tell the visitors anything about the statues or who made them or why they were there, was that these people were somehow unconnected to, the civilization, as they saw it, the culture that had created, that turned this island into this great sort of sculpture park. And so right at the beginning of outsider interest in Rapa Nui, there was this thing that needed explaining, which was this conflict between a tiny population on a bleak island and this physical evidence for something that seemed to be much bigger. And when Torhardal got on the island, and his was the first, whatever you say, and I could say all sorts of things that I don't like about Torhardal, but as well as being a great writer and explorer, he brought with him to Rapa Nui a great team of archaeologists, and they did a fantastic project there. And one of the archaeologists in that team is an American guy called Bill Malloy, and he immediately cottoned on to the idea that the island had been once covered in forests, and the islanders had cut down all the trees, and that this was the explanation, that they'd overreached themselves, destroyed their own ecology. And over the years, he grew this idea into a kind of biblical saga of destruction. And this was at the time that books like Silent Spring and Limits to Growth, there was a lot of discussion about the idea that we were living on a small planet, and the focus was particularly on population. There were too many people. We had to do something about this, or we'd all starve in the future. And Bill Malloy kind of created this vision for Rapa Nui that fitted into that idea. And it basically, the idea was that islanders had reached above their station, really. The population had got out of control. They had cut down so many trees to grow food, and in particular to move statues, that the soils were eroded and they ended up short of food, and society collapsed in a sort of fit of cannibalism and starvation and war. And the idea of war was something that came from island legends, which were recorded and retold and elaborated by missionaries. And so for me, the missionaries were complicit in this idea of ecocide, in building up this picture. Now, until Jared Diamond came on the scene, this story was relatively sort of limited to academics and archaeologists and Easter Island nerds. But the great popular science writer Jared Diamond wrote a book called Collapse, and sort of looking at societies around the world and everything that people had done wrong. And he had one chapter, and it's just a superb piece of writing. It's very dramatic and beautifully written. He's a great writer. And he had one chapter on Rapa Nui, and in that he basically elaborated this story that Bill Malloy had created, and other archaeologists also agreed with him. And by then also there had been evidence had been obtained from the island that it really had once been covered in palm forest or in forest, and that this has all disappeared. This archaeologist and scientists had found pollen and so on to prove that this was the case. And Jared Diamond had a great way of telling this story, and that particular chapter has recently been republished by the publisher as in a series of little books they published as sort of ideas that change the way we think about the world. And they called it The Last Tree on Easter Island. Okay, so it's a great story. And it's still, I mean, academics, archaeologists have not been happy about this for a couple of decades. And there's a lot of research to show that one way or another, every element in the ecocide theory does not really stand up to scrutiny. Clearly, the island was once forested, and by the 1860s, it wasn't. There's no getting away from that. So one of the lines that archaeologists approach is try to explain why the island was deforested without blaming the islanders for it. And there's a popular thesis which has been promoted by, amongst other people, Carl Lippo and Terry Hunt in the States, suggesting that the reason the palms disappeared was not people but rats. And there's a Pacific rat that travelled with people across the ocean. It sort of got onto the ships, but they actually ate the rat as well. It was a source of food, and it might have been particularly significant on Rapa Nui because although they managed to bring chickens with them, pigs never made it to Rapa Nui, and that's a really important animal in Polynesian culture and diet. And so archaeologists found palm nuts that had been chewed by rats. You can see the little tooth marks in them. And so the idea is that rats sort of were alien animals on the island, and they ate all these nuts, and the palm trees disappeared. And okay, so but that's one of many little side avenues, taking apart this ecocide theory. And to a greater or less extent, all these arguments stand up. I think the particularly important one is there's absolutely no evidence for one warfare on the island, just none. And it's interesting in itself because there are many other Polynesian islands. There's very clear evidence for it. So we have big earthwork defences, for example, on hilltops. There are hilltops on Rapa Nui. There's not a single military earthwork. And the other thing is that there's no evidence at all for a population collapse before Europeans arrived. All the archaeologists suggest there's a densely populated, a well-populated island, and there was never, as does genetic research, DNA, that there was no population bottleneck or anything like that, that everything went fine. Now, when I looked at it, one of the things I found was that if we look at the first European records of the island from the visitors, and there were 4 expeditions passed by Easter Island, only for a day or two each one, in the 18th century. The first one came from Holland in 1722. And to a greater or lesser extent, drill down into the records of these voyages, they describe an island where, already there are not many trees. There really are not many trees. But there is a very powerful and successful land management system. They're growing plenty of food, and they're doing it in a really skilled way. So not only are they growing the food, but they're using techniques which at that very time were being experimented with in Enlightenment Europe. And they include things like fertilizing using ash, possibly growing green manure crops, crop rotation, leaving land fallow for a season to recover. And they have very specific things, like there's a particular tree that they used for fabric, for materials, which was quite important. And these trees were grown in little walled enclosures to protect them from the sea and from the wind. And there's a map. The best report on this comes from the French expedition, and it took with them a gardener. And the idea was that he would report back to Louis in France, the king, on what the potential was for growing European crops and what islanders were doing in the Pacific. And he left the most detailed report of how things were happening on the island. And there's actually plans, there's maps of fields laid out with great precision and intensity, just covering every bit of flat land. And they're doing things like they're laying out banana trees, banana plants in rows with string. It's almost industrial farming. It's incredibly successful. And I think that's something that's been missed. And my point is that this was happening when the first Europeans arrived. So there's absolutely no evidence there that there's any kind of collapse. People are well fed and well organized. On the other hand, we go forward a century to these scientific expeditions that arrived between 1868 and 1886. The island is bleak and there are hardly any fields. And it's like, what happened? And what happened was in 1862, sort of autumn 1862, spring 1863, just over a period of a few months, the island was attacked by slave raiders coming from elsewhere in the Pacific and from Chile and Peru. And they were soon followed by missionaries. And the slave raiding only happened for a few months. A large number of people were taken off the island and sold into slavery on the continental mainland of America. Slavery was then already illegal, but they sort of got around it through bureaucratic means. But there were strong objections to it very rapidly on the continent and elsewhere in the Pacific. And the government in Peru was soon forced to send these slaves back into the Pacific, and a bunch were taken back to Rapa Nui. Many had died in the meantime working in South America, but a bunch were taken back and they took smallpox with them. And so then there was then a massive loss of life through disease on the island. And then missionaries arrived and people started leaving the island and were taken elsewhere, taken to what is now French Polynesia, Tahiti and other islands to work on plantations. And you can see what's happening on the island at the time. The people are actually not unhappy to leave. Things are getting really bad. And there's a very violent man who comes in from Tahiti who sets up a sheep ranch. And he sees that this opportunity that by now, with so few islanders, the gardens are all overgrown and abandoned. And the missionaries are trying to move islanders into the little village, the town that they create. And so most of the island is becoming depopulated. And what this guy does was he sort of somehow fudges ownership of virtually the entire island, imports thousands of sheep. And within a few years, the sheep population vastly exceeds the human population. And in time, the sheep ranch takes over the entire island, and a wall is built like a Berlin Wall around the island community, and they are literally walled into a compound. And this survives up until the 1950s and 60s, and it's policed by people with guns, and there's gates that are locked at night. It's the most extraordinary thing. And that is the Easter Island community, and the rest of the island is just a sheep ranch.
So before that time, people were living all around the island?
Of course, yes.
Up until they were forced to collectivize.
They were living, and mostly
village?
around the coast. The good soils, the best soils were low down around the coast. And the only fresh water there are no rivers, no streams on the island. And the only fresh water is around the coast where the water table bubbles up just out to sea. And so there are springs where they get fresh water around the coast. So that, and very intensively all around the coast. And that's where you find most of the statues, it's around the coast, among the communities. And so all these were abandoned. But that was not because islanders had destroyed their world. It's because visiting Europeans had destroyed their world and their communities. And with that had gone the wisdom and the experience and the knowledge of elders who managed rituals and religion and communities, and society just completely collapsed.
So what was the effect of sheep farming on the landscape? It must have totally devastated any traces of the intensive agriculture that was there before.
Well, I mean, speaking as an archaeologist, you can never completely eradicate these things. There's a lot of evidence out there, and I'm too young to do it. I'm too old now to do this. But if I was younger, I think I'd be really interested in going out there and doing some field work, because my instinct tells me, and from what I have seen when I did go there as well, that there's actually a fantastic amount of archaeology to discover in terms of land use on the island in its early history. But yes, sheep ranching, and there were a lot of cattle as well over the years, did a huge amount of damage to the landscape. So, for example, walls were built across the island to corral the animals so they could manage moving flocks about and from one part of the island to another and letting land recover and so on. And of course, they were growing grass, so they imported all these grass plants. So by the time we get into the 20th century, there's very little native vegetation left, and it's almost all introduced. And it is, according to visitors, at the beginning of the 20th century, it is absolutely wonderful sort of grass landscape, really good for sheep and cattle. But what they do, so they build these walls, and often they're taking stones from the monuments, from the statues around the coast are standing on huge stone plinths, which have, particularly in many cases, really fine dry stonework. And these are taken apart to build walls to corral sheep. And the cattle and sheep, they kind of wander all over these former sacred sites, these burial grounds, and they're just kicking stuff around and rubbing against stones that have shallow carvings on, eroding ancient carvings. And generally, I think, damaging sacred sites. I mean, it's really powerful stuff. So in a sense, the sheep and the cattle are continuing the project of eradication that was begun by the slave raiders in the 1860s.
So you mentioned that we have the people that later Europeans found had very little connection to or memories of the culture that built the monuments, but we do have some interesting records that I'd never heard of until I read your book, compiled by an eccentric wealthy couple who are at the center of your narrative. So who were the Routledges?
Right. Okay. In the early 20th century, there's a very wealthy English couple called Catherine and Scoresby Routledge. And for various reasons, they liked to get out of Britain. They were quite eccentric, but independent-minded individuals. And Catherine, in particular, as a woman, found society constrained her enormously and patronized her and wanted to enjoy adventures elsewhere. And her husband, who was actually Scoresby, who was born in Australia, was a ardent traveller and an outdoors man, and he liked hunting and fishing for big fish. And the pair of them seemed to have got on really well, sort of an unexpected pairing, really. But and they went on an expedition immediately after they were married. They went out to Africa and spent some time in what is now northern Kenya among people we then known as Kikuyu. And so they did this fantastic ethnographic work and had a lot of adventures and enjoyed themselves. And they came back and then they wrote a rather good book for the time, about it. Because there were, of course, at this time, late 19th century, early 20th century, there were a number of wealthy people traveling around the world and writing about their adventures in newspapers and writing books and very often making stuff up. And you can, from some of these books, you can distill little bits of useful information about the worlds they were traveling in. But very few of them did anything on the scale that the Routledges did. And their book about the Kikuyu is a really good piece of, for its time, early ethnographic study, and it's sensitive to the people they were with. So one of the interesting things that they acknowledge is that Catherine, as a woman, was able to talk to people that her husband, as a man, was not able to, and to an extent vice versa. And so they worked together very well on that. Then they thought, what are we going to do next? We want to go somewhere else. And they went to the British Museum. Being sort of posh, wealthy people, this is what you do. You go to the top. And they went to the British Museum and found this curator and said, we want to go somewhere exciting. We want to have an adventure, but we also want to do something useful. Where could we go that would be useful? And this curator, amazingly, said, why don't you go to Easter Island? And at first, they rejected the idea because they had learnt, as was the common perception at the time, that there was nothing left on Easter Island of any interest. There were a load of statues, but what they were particularly interested in was talking to people. They were interested in ethnography in different communities and societies and so on, and how they worked. And they had this idea that if they went to Easter Island, it would be a bit like, going out somewhere in London, they'd just be talking to more Europeans and trying to keep up with gossip, which didn't interest them at all. And the British Museum curator knew this solicitor who collected artifacts in specific. He never went out there. but he bought them in auctions, and he developed a lot of contacts in the Pacific. And he knew somebody who worked quite well, who lived, a European, who worked on Easter Island for the ranch company, as it then was. And this guy persuaded the collector in London that there were still some elderly islanders who remembered what happened, what it was like on the island before the slave raids. And they convinced the Routledges, and that sealed it for them. So off they went. Well, I say off they went. It took a year or so before they could get their act together. And they decided, I think, completely mad. I mean, they did all sorts of things that were utterly eccentric and not helpful to themselves. They decided they had to build their own ship, and it had to be made out of timber, in case anything went wrong in the remote Pacific, and they would then be able to fix it themselves. And so they went to a traditional boatyard that was already then, on its last legs, that ships were rarely still made out of timber. And they commissioned a boat, a fantastic ship with a top designer for the time. And eventually, after a lot of trouble, they managed to get it going, and they set sail, and they sailed out across the Atlantic, down the coast of South America, around the bottom, up the coast, and eventually out to Rapa Nui, and arriving there in 1914. And originally they'd set out they called themselves a scientific expedition, and they planned to have a geologist, an archaeologist, and an astronomer. The astronomer, I think, was partly there because his father was very wealthy, and they sort of sensed that this man was going to help fund their expedition. And although they appeared themselves to have a fair amount of money, they didn't like spending it. But the astronomer pulled out because he basically had a row with them. They lost a couple of crews in the time they were trying to get the expedition together and get the ship together, because they had rows with all these people who were going to come with them. The archaeologist did go out with them. He turned out, he was young at the time, relatively unknown, became later in life one of the great figures in British archaeology, a guy called O.G.S. Crawford. But he rowed with them on ship and jumped ship off the coast of Africa and scuttled back to Britain. So they set up across the Atlantic without a scientist, because their geologists they scheduled to meet in South America, a young British guy who was also, by all accounts, recognised as an absolutely brilliant up-and-coming young geologist. Eventually they did meet up, but the poor chap got really ill and was sent back to Britain. So when they finally set out to Easter Island, it was just the two of them, and plus the crew of kind of fishermen and the old Royal Navy captain. And so they had none of the scientific team that they expected to have with them was there, and they were left on their own. Now, they had both studied, to a greater or less extent, they studied a bit of anthropology at Oxford University. So they had that. And Catherine had worked with an anthropologist in Oxford who did some great archaeology work. So they had a bit of training. But when you look at the archaeology work they did, you can see it wasn't very great. So whatever they achieved was really down to their own initiative on the island. And they were there for 16 or 17 months. And it was the most extraordinary thing. There was a revolution on the island. And I suspect it was partly stimulated by their presence, because they brought with them indications they were living, for them, primitively, but for islanders, they brought with them huge wealth, possessions. And the islanders at the time were living in this compound managed by a ranch company, a Scottish multinational company. And they were prevented from leaving the island because the company, quite rightly, I think, was afraid that if they did leave the island, they would discover how badly they were being treated and would revolt. And so these islanders said, right, we've had enough of this. And they set out to basically slaughter animals, the cattle and sheep that they were prevented from seeing. They went out, raided, and they killed hundreds of these animals. And it's the most extraordinary thing, the descriptions in Catherine's diary of blood flowing down the streets and screaming beasts being flayed and hung up on trees, and vastly more meat than the community could ever have realistically consumed. And the Routledges were in a really difficult position, because on the one hand, their loyalty was to the British company and the island manager. On the other hand, Catherine in particular had already developed some quite close relationships with islanders. And they were particularly, in their own kind of self-centered way, afraid that this would interfere with their field work, that the islanders would no longer talk to them. And so they tried to reconcile the warring factions without any success whatsoever. And it came to a head when they fled the village and camped out the other side of the island near the quarries where the statues were made to escape what was happening in the town where they thought they would be safe. And then one day this bunch of horses appeared over the horizon with these men with guns. And they honestly thought, I think at that moment, their days were finished. And they discovered that unexpectedly they had a respect for Catherine. And Catherine was treated, I think, as a kind of honorary islander. And she got on well with this elderly lady on the island who turned out to be the ringleader, a very powerful woman called Angata, who was a kind of, she was partly spiritualist, partly Christian missionary type, and partly and very significantly and powerfully drawing on traditional Rapa Nui concepts of life and power. And she'd driven this revolution, but she understood Catherine, and I think Catherine understood her as a kind of fellow oppressed female in a male-dominated society. And so the strange thing was that when this little posse of men came over with guns from the town, and the Routledges expected to be attacked, they'd actually come as friends. And so they got through that one, and it wasn't long after that, completely coincidentally, a Chilean Navy ship turned up on the island and immediately drew the whole thing to a close, rounded up the main culprits of the revolutions and cast them into prison. And that was it. But so they had an adventurous time. But in the meantime, Scoresby, Catherine's husband, had taken their ship to Chile, where it was in harbour. And the Chilean authorities wouldn't let him back out because of the war. And so for 3 months, Catherine was alone with one guy from the ship. The rest of the crew were on the mainland in Chile, among the islanders. And it was that during that time, I think she did her most significant work with the islanders. She talked to a lot of elderly people, men and women. And by then she'd taught herself a rudimentary Rapa Nui, and she was able to talk to them in their own language. And she filled notebooks and sheets of paper with interviews and lists of names and place names, individuals, genealogies, legends, stories about the island, just endless stuff in a sort of chaotic, driven style, just bad handwriting, chaotic notes, and just masses and masses of stuff. Most extraordinary record. And these were people who, most of the people she was talking to were really quite elderly. And within 10 or 20 years, almost all of them had passed on. And the guy in London, the solicitor in London, was right. Some of these people did remember things before the slave raids. So we can look at what she recorded and think some of these stories probably are rooted in traditional Rapa Nui ideas and mythologies, but as remembered by very young people who weren't part of, as it were, the telling of those stories so much as the hearing of them, and who had been through traumatic years of disease and starvation and slave raiding and so on, and seeing their communities and relatives being killed and transported out of the island and so on. So traumatized individuals. So fantastic records, but, clearly they're going to be only partial and need to be read with care. But the tragedy is, so there's this fantastic archive material that they've got, all these interviews, and also a huge amount of field work. The excavations weren't great at all. They dug up dozens and dozens of statues at the quarries with very poor record. But they also did a lot of surveys, and nothing like this had ever been done in the island before. They brought all this stuff back to Britain. And Catherine and Scoresby, both of them gave a lot of lectures to academic communities and conferences. And their work was very well received. And Catherine wrote this fantastic book about the island and its history and so on. Really good, packed with stuff. But her basic interpretation of the island was that that is that everything on the island had been created by Polynesian people, was challenged by Oxford academics, of course all men, who all felt that they understood the island better than she did. None of them had actually been there, but a bunch of them had done work in the far eastern Pacific, places like New Guinea. And Catherine didn't really have the confidence to stand up against these men, and she tried to weave their ideas into her own interpretations in a completely disastrous attempt to explain how the island had been settled and discovered and who built the statues and so on. And they felt that the only solution to sort this out was to go back out to the Pacific, because when on their first expedition, they had planned to spend part of the time on Easter Island, 6 months, and then part of the time on other islands in Polynesia, looking for the homeland of the people who had discovered Rapa Nui. But because of the war and because of the uprising, they had been delayed. Now, the delay and Scoresby's incarceration on the mainland away from the island gave Catherine the opportunity to do interviews and field work she would not otherwise not have been able to do. So ironically, it actually increased the amount of work they did on Easter Island, but it stopped them going anywhere else. So they thought, right, let's go back. We'll look for the origins of these Easter Islanders. And Catherine's thinking, I'll be able to show these men that I was right and they were wrong. So they went out for another 2 or 3 years. This time with the commercial shipping. Most of that time they spent on Mangareva, which today is very popular among academics and archaeologists as, in fact, the homeland for the people who did discover and colonize Easter Island. And again, Catherine interviewed a lot of people and recorded a lot of stuff. And significantly, Mangareva did not suffer the depredations of slave raids and disease in the way that Easter Island did. And there were good reasons for thinking that many of the stories that Catherine was recording were simply passed down without break and without the kind of trauma and the loss that happened on Rapa Nui. So this stuff is incredibly significant that she recorded there. Then came back to Britain, and by this time their marriage is starting to fall apart. Catherine buys one of the most expensive private residences in London, looking out across Hyde Park. Vast to look at, you think, why does 2 people need something as big as this? I mean, it's absolutely huge. And these properties now, one of them is divided into 7 or 8 different apartments. This is one house like Catherine bought, each of which sells on the market for well over £1 million. And anyway, she's bought this house, and before long, she shut Scoresby out. She just didn't get on. She didn't want him. She thought he was exploiting her, and put all his possessions into store. And they argued for about a year, and eventually Catherine was clearly showing signs of mental illness. She was posting notices outside, sticking notices on the walls outside, and because of her aristocratic status and so on, she was in the news a lot. The press were interested in what was going on, and she put these notices up saying, "Help! I'm being poisoned. You know, they're trying to get me." All this kind of stuff, and she bolted all the doors and put boards up all the windows and everything. And eventually, Scoresby tried really hard, and eventually he gave up and arranged for her to be moved to a mental home, mental asylum. And he achieved that by kidnapping her. They got a car disguised, and they broke into the house and bundled her into this vehicle and drove her to the asylum. And she spent the last few years of her life in this asylum where she died. And despite her pleas, she was given absolutely no access to her records so that she could write up her stuff. So she was unable to complete her work. However, when she did die and her will was released, in there she had left a large sum of money to be made available to the British Museum or the Royal Anthropological Institute for the analysis and publication of her work. And this is something that was not known to the British Museum, as far as I can see today. And it didn't happen. And one of the things I was really curious to know is why this did not happen. Because if it had, it would have transformed not just our, as it were, in Britain and America and so on, understanding of Rapa Nui archaeology and history. I mean, it really would have completely changed the 20th century understanding of Rapa Nui. But also, of course, it's hugely significant for people on the island and in wider Pacific Polynesian culture today. And it would have completely seen off this ecocide theory. for example, which is so deeply patronizing to the history of Polynesians. And why didn't it happen? And in the end, I figured what went wrong was that Scoresby was an impatient man, and he had tried in the early years to reason with Catherine, but the marriage just broke up. And he was, weirdly, he was one of the trustees of the will. So he had power over what happened with her will. And in the end, he lost patience. And I think he did not want to give up control of these records. He wanted, which would have happened, if they'd been given to the British Museum. There was no question in his mind that whoever got to do the job, whoever the British Museum employed using this money to do this work, it wouldn't have been him. And he knew that. And he just didn't want to give them up. And so what he did was he hid all the records, and he became, as it were, the representative of the will, talking to the British Museum and the anthropologists. The curator that he talked to happened to be president of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and he decided that this wasn't of any interest to the British Museum, and he talked to Scoresby on behalf of the Royal Anthropological Institute. So the British Museum was barely aware this was happening, and which was ironic because Scoresby and Catherine had earlier given a huge collection of artifacts from Rapa Nui and elsewhere in the Pacific to the British Museum. So it would have been the perfect place for these records. And what he showed to the Royal Anthropological Institute was just a few diaries and notebooks from their second expedition. I mean, there's enough notebooks and records to fill 3 or 4 tin trunks from Rapa Nui. And none of them, I think, at the time the will was being discussed, knew these existed, and Scoresby had hidden them.
So are they available to researchers now?
Well, exactly. Now? They surfaced. They were what he did was he'd given most of them on loan to the Royal Geographical Society in London. He didn't mention that to the British Museum and the Royal Anthropological Institute. They were already there at the Royal Geographical Society. He didn't mention that at all. And other stuff he kept back, including all the records from their second expedition. And they were the whole lot were thought lost. So other anthropologists who worked on Easter Island tried desperately to access Catherine's records, but were told they were lost or they couldn't have access to them. And this myth spread that they'd actually been destroyed in a fire in Jamaica, that they no longer existed. And it wasn't until the 1970s that an archaeologist happened to come across this archive in the Royal Geographical Society. But he never published it. He didn't tell many people about it. And to this day, the Royal Geographical Society archive, which you can go and see, and I spent many happy days leafing through all this stuff there, and they've got a wonderful library which you can do this, but it hasn't been published. It's not online. It hasn't been analysed, and my goodness, it does need analysing because it's a complete mess. But there's so much stuff in there. And there's other stuff like the second expedition. Over the past decade, there have been a handful of sales, private sales at sale rooms where documents, diaries and photographs, particularly from their second expedition, but also a bit, I think, from the Rapa Nui expedition as well, have appeared in sales and been bought by private buyers and then disappeared again. But the stuff's out there, and so one of the big pleas I have in this book is, look, academics, archaeologists, anthropologists, you don't realise just how much of this stuff there is there to analyse and how precious it is. Go for it. It's as an archaeologist, I say, I know I've spent during the course of my career a lot of time working with archives from old excavations, which modern archaeologists tend to think, well, the techniques were so bad, the record keeping was so bad, there's not going to be anything there of any use. But it's amazing. It doesn't matter how bad they look. When you get into them, you're going to find something. Partly because archaeological excavation is destructive. You excavate something, you destroy it as you go, and the payoff is that you learn from this destruction. But there is this kind of Faustian pact in archaeology, and so whatever they excavated no longer exists. So whatever the record there is, it's going to be telling us something we could no longer find out by working on the island. But there is much really good stuff there, I think. And of course, it's interesting for its own time as well.
So one of the most surprising things that, to me, that came out of some of that research or that you referenced in your book had to do with the statues. The popular story that in all these earlier books is that the statues were meant to be erected around the coast, and something happened which caused people to just drop their tools and walk away
Mm.
from it, and the society fell apart. But you mentioned that Catherine Routledge's research, she discovered what she called processional roads, and she studied the statues along the roads, and she concluded that they were supposed to be there. That's where they were meant to end up. That's really interesting. And then you built a very interesting picture of the entire statue project, or this cultural undertaking. You posited three different types of statues: the ones erected on plinths around the coast, the ones along the roadside, and the massive ones that are connected to the rock and the quarry at Ranaraku. And you flipped the timeline that I understood. I always thought the giant statues in the quarries came last, and they just couldn't finish them. You say they were the earliest ones of the
Yeah,
bunch,
I
and
mean,
that the location of all these things was intentional. So could you paint a picture of this new interpretation of these remarkable artifacts?
I think this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the statues. I should say that when I did get to Easter Island, and it was almost by accident, I'd been to the Marquesas, I was in Tahiti, and my money was running out, and I had another month or so left before I could get my plane ticket to get out. And weirdly, the cheapest place that I could get to was Easter Island. So we went, my then wife and I, we went then to Easter Island, and I was completely bowled over. I mean, the statues, you just can't imagine. It is utterly amazing. They are sculpturally so powerful. Just one statue is amazing. But when you've got hundreds of them, and the actual count is over 1,000, although that does include a lot that are in the quarries that are still part of the rock. But it's utterly amazing. And if you're an archaeologist, it's not just the statues. There's so many other structures built out of stone. It's just an astonishing place. Now, the current theory, popular theory among archaeologists, is that all the statues were made at more or less the same time over a period of centuries, as it were, but all together. And that the goal was to have these standing on plinths around the coast among the communities. And they all stand on these great long rectangular stone boxes with their backs to the sea, looking across the fields and villages of the people who put them up. At the quarries, which are almost all the statues came from this one group of quarries, which is a particularly distinctive volcanic outcrop at one end of the island. There are large numbers of apparently unfinished statues, and that fueled the early, collapse theory that you look at these things and it looks as if suddenly everybody down tools and hundreds of statues are abandoned. And there are also these statues, as you mentioned, along what Catherine called a road, or roads, and she was the first to discover these, that branch out from the statues that lie flat on the ground. And so the idea was that these were statues that were on their way out from the quarries to the coast, and again had been abandoned. And so this collapse, that fitted the collapse theory very well. But for archaeologists who want to argue that there was no collapse, quite rightly, then you have to explain what's going on here and there. The idea is that these are statues that one reason or another were abandoned over the centuries because something went wrong at the quarry, because they just weren't finished, or something fell over at the wrong place, and so on. So there was this gradual accumulation of these unfinished statues at the quarry and the fallen ones by the roads. Now, the problem with that, to me as an archaeologist, is that the statues in those three different locations, coast, road, and quarries, are not the same. The statues at the quarry and beside the road are, on average, significantly bigger than those along the coast. And the shapes of the statues at the quarries in particular are much more varied than those around the coast. And that matters, of course, because you then think, well, the ones that are at the quarries and that are by the roads, on the face of it, they don't look as if they were on their way out to the coast because they're so different. And also, when you go look at the coast, the plinths are all full. Where are these hundreds of statues going to go? And you think if you're going to take statues out to the coast, you think you would have planned it. You wouldn't just sort of randomly think, oh, I'm going to make a statue. I'm going to put all this effort to make a giant statue. And I'm going to drag it across the island. Then I'm going to think, where shall I put it? There's nowhere for them to go. So I think that it looks to me as if these things are happening in different ways. And it struck me that it's also likely that they happened at different times. And this is where I get into complete So up to this point, I think it's incontrovertible. The statues are different. Although more work needs to be done on the island to actually study these statues, to analyze the shapes in such a way that they can all be compared, and that hasn't yet really been done. But what we don't really know, we don't have the chronology, we don't have the radiocarbon dates and so on. There hasn't been the excavation, that a particular type of excavation that would help really resolve this issue of timing. But it seemed to me that one likely hypothesis is that it starts at the quarries. I mean, it's going to start at the quarries by definition. So you start building statues at the quarries, and at some stage you think, okay, we've got enough statues here, or maybe people out in the villages think, those statues over at the quarries, we want some among our fields, among our houses, and so on. So that at some point there's this change where statues that are just being built, erected at the quarries, are then starting to be carved and moved out into the communities. And it makes sense that when that happens, that the statues get a bit smaller, because they got to take them on these much longer journeys. And by then also some of the best rock would have already been worked out by making these really big statues at the quarries. And what they're doing at the quarries is they're actually standing them up. So they make these huge statues and they stand them up in pits in the ground. And as the quarries are worked, more and more rock, debris and dirt is falling down around these statues, and they're slowly buried from the bottom up. And so when we look at the quarries today, you can see what look like heads in many cases. And this is where the idea of Easter Island heads comes from, is that these were the only ones that were standing up from, after the end of the 19th century. And they're largely just heads. And so you get this idea of Easter Island heads, but actually the bodies are buried deeply under all this quarry debris and soil. And that was something that Catherine and Scoresby's excavations revealed for the first time on a grand scale. So we don't even know how big many of these statues are. And so I suspect, with further excavation, or at the very least with kind of geophysical, non-invasive survey techniques at the quarries, we get a better idea of the scale of the number of these statues that are buried. And I suspect there are some statues that are completely buried. There are more statues there than we realise. And I suspect in the process, we'd find that the average size of the statues of the quarries would actually rise. So I think the statues of the quarries are initially carved out and stood up at the quarries to create a kind of sacred mountain that operates for the entire island and all the communities, and different communities from around the island are coming together at this one place. They're also, maybe at the same time, maybe a bit later, they have these perhaps sacred processional ways that lead the communities to join together at the quarries, and they raise statues either side of these roads, these tracks, these stone paths, to in some kind of sacred way again. So they're monumentalizing the landscape. And then later, the islanders start to build their own individual statue complexes on the plinths on the coast, and that is where they're burying their dead. They're probably building these stone cairns for burial, possibly with very small statues or possibly with carved wooden figures. And both of those are common, or were common, on the nearest Polynesian islands like the Marquesas, for example, from elsewhere in Polynesia. So this is something the islanders, the original colonizers, would have brought with them, this idea that you have these burial places, these ritual spaces in your community, and you raise wooden posts or small stone statues, carved posts. So I think that would have already been happening around the coast, and they would have been burying their dead there. So what they're doing at a certain point is they're saying, we want really big statues. They increase the size of the plinths, they carve these bigger statues, carry them out and raise them up on the plinths, and make this absolutely monumental landscape on this tiny island. I mean, it's just hard to imagine what it must have been like when so many statues were standing around the coast, and these are all active sites, and when there would have been not just a stone, but there would have been timber structures, there would have been fabric and paint, who knows, fire, noise, music.
We think of Easter Island as kind of an anomalous place, and in many ways it is, but that's an interesting picture that you paint. It's a continuity of cultures where there were these similar grave sites in other parts of Polynesia, the places where they may have come from, and then they continued this process with the materials that they had, which is largely stone, and then they elaborated it and built on it. And But that continuity to the rest of Polynesian culture is interesting. It
Yeah,
certainly it lays to rest the I don't want to go into it, but the alien theories and all this idiocy. I mean,
yeah, we don't
it's
need that. I mean, the thing is, the human story is so much more interesting, and and I think it's so much more extraordinary because, exactly as you say, the people and the culture on this island are totally Polynesian in the early stage of its history. Are totally Polynesian, and they're bringing with them all these ideas about family relationships and the afterlife and religion and attitudes to animals and landscape and art and so on. But what's remarkable is that on this tiny little island with its challenging ecology and its remoteness, and fairly rapidly, I think its isolation from the rest of Polynesia, rather than lose that Polynesian culture, they turbocharge it. And over time, the entire island becomes a monumental representation of their beliefs. And it's something you don't really see anywhere else in the Pacific. And I think partly through an accident of geology, on the island where the quarries are is around a crater, and there's a little lake there. And that's at one end of the island. And at the other end of the island, there's a big crater high up with tall cliffs dropping almost vertically down into the Pacific. And all around, literally, you have nothing but sea. All around, you just see the horizon is sea everywhere. And in Polynesian cosmology, cosmogony, there is this kind of idea that people and life and even things like islands and geology and stuff has a natural life cycle that comes from darkness, from the underworld in the east, into the world of the living, and then back again into the darkness in the west. And the quarry statues, the statue quarry, which is made of an exceptional rock, it's really soft and relatively lightweight. And it's a really unusual type of volcanic tuff. And it's so easy to carve. It's almost easier than carving wood, a statue out of this stone. So by complete chance, there is this quarry. There is this crater lake with this soft rock where all the statues are carved at one end of the island. And at the other end of the island, there's a crater with very steep sides and a lake at the bottom with these cliffs down to the sea. So it's easy to imagine how these people could have seen these two lakes as portals into that underworld, that darkness from which life comes and to which it returns. And they are at the right sides. One is the quarry is at the east where the sun rises. The big crater lake deep down is at the west where the sun sets. And so the island becomes this representation of this voyage from east to west, this life voyage. And the whole thing is monumentalized with these hundreds of statues, which are representing individuals and powerful mythic islanders.
so you said that the plinths contain graves. Would that be the graves of anyone in the community or just high ranking people? And what role did the top knots play? What did that represent?
Okay, two questions. We don't know who was buried there. And on the face of it, and of course, this is for obvious reasons, this is not an area that there's going to be a lot of modern excavation because these are sensitive, sacred sites with human remains, and you can't just plow into these. Much as with my archaeological hat on, I would like to do because I think we could learn a lot. But who was buried in these sites, we don't know. On the face of it, they were using both inhumation and cremation. And cremation, typically in sort of outside modern crematoria, you still have a lot of remain left to bury. And they were burying people, or the remains of people, they were burying in boxes and stone boxes at the back of these plinths. There are also a lot of burials inside the mounds at the front of the plinths that were supporting the plinths, and over which later statues would fall, and they were burying people underneath fallen statues. And so they're all around, and I suspect majority of people in one way or another were able to use those spaces for resting their own remains in due course. And of course, on such a small island with so few communities, that would all have been quite close-knit. There would have been this knowledge of these people who were buried in these places, and they would have become, each plinth and its statues and its stories would have become immensely powerful, emotive locations. The other part of your question, the top knots, the hats, the statues are carved, as I mentioned, out of a really soft volcanic rock, and it has kind of yellowish brown colour. And many, but not certainly not all, a minority, but many of the statues around the coast, none at the quarries or beside the roads, but around the coast, had stone hats plonked on the top. And these are like round, like drum shapes, sometimes tapering a bit as they rise up. But they're massive things weighing several tons. And these are carved out of a different type of rock, which, interestingly, comes from the other side, the western side of the island, a small quarry. And again, this is quite a soft, lightweight rock. And it's pink. It's a scoria, volcanic scoria. And it's pink coloured. And so you've got these pink hats, almost red hats, sitting on top, or crowns. I think crown is quite a good word. And we don't know what they represent, whether they represent hats or headdresses or hair or anything else. But we have these crowns of pink stone sitting on top of these yellow statues. And red and yellow, hey presto, are sacred colours in Polynesian culture. And we have an expedition, I'm really looking forward to it, coming up early next year at the British Museum about Hawaii and Britain and things that happened, particularly in the 19th century and the 18th century, between the two countries, the two nations. And the British Museum has, among other institutions, has these astonishing yellow and red and black feathered headdresses from Hawaii. And I can't help but think that this coincidental occurrence of this red stone and this yellow stone, the hat and the statue, is actually a knowing recognition of this tradition that is expressed elsewhere in Polynesia in feather headdresses. And these are high, these headdresses are very high status things.
And the one big mystery that everybody obsesses over, of course, is how do they move these statues on this little island with very few trees? Legend says that the statues walked and experiments were done to kind of move them like a refrigerator upright. Yeah. But you've dismissed that theory because the bottoms would have, I guess, been worn away. So how do you think they moved them?
I mean, it's a bit like Stonehenge. I mean, my book about Stonehenge was how to build Stonehenge. And I literally looked at every aspect of the construction of the monument. And at the end of the day, I mean, the one thing you can say is that they did it. Stonehenge is there, the statues are there. So somehow or other, they must have moved them. That's the only thing that we can be certain of. There is this idea that they were walked by, as you say, by wobbling them like statues with ropes. And it's immensely impressive and effective. And this has been successfully done in experiments with replica statues. And the logic behind that is it's being proposed particularly by archaeologists who are concerned about the absence of trees. And so the rats ate all the trees. So how do they move the statues? They haven't got any timber to move statues. So they walk them. That shows that supports the idea that they had a functioning society and so on, and that it wasn't cutting down trees to move the statues that caused the deforestation, because they didn't need trees to move statues. Now, I'm frankly skeptical of this. It looks great when you're doing this with concrete replicas, full size, fair enough, on a kind of smooth dirt track. But there aren't smooth tracks on Rapa Nui. It's not level ground. It undulates. It's incredibly rocky, rough lava rock everywhere. Now, we talked about roads. Now, roads is a kind of, in inverted commas. These are, to an extent, they look like sort of paved areas, but they're irregular and rough. And again, they go up and down over the landscape. And I think my concern is that from a logistical point of view, the risk for these spiritual, highly symbolic and empowered artifacts, if you like, these statues freshly carved, at a point, and carving the stone, exposing the fresh stone, it's at its softest, that the risk of damage to these statues is too great. And there will be too much, these aren't just statues. These are symbolic of all kinds of things, of relationships, of religious beliefs, and so on. And if you break a statue, then it's going to be more than just, oh, damn, I've got to go and get another one. It's going to be, it's going to be ritually damaging and politically, socially embarrassing. And I think Thor Heyerdahl actually worked with a guy who did walk an actual Rapa Nui statue for a bit, and they found bits were chipping off the bottom, barely started, and they had to abandon the project. And there's also the danger that if it could fall over. I mean, the best will in the world, accidents happen, and if it falls over as it's being moved, it's likely to break. And are you going to risk that? And I'm not convinced. And I don't know how they did it, but they must have used timber. There has to have been, a certain amount of timber to move these things. I think banana plants could have been useful, and there are records of banana plants being used to move canoes elsewhere in the Pacific. And one of the interesting things there is that bananas are not trees, but they do have this great fat trunk-like stem, and it's quite soft. So if you have a lot of these and you lay them down and you're launching a really big, heavy canoe, what happens is that the canoe, as it were, cuts into the stems, which ooze out this sap, which actually lubricates the movement of the canoe. And I can see how laying down a bed of banana stems and leaves could actually have been very much part of the solution, how these statues were moved. It would protect them from damage, but also kind of provide a kind of lubricated bed. But I think they must have had timber, and they have to have been able to build sledges. However, what's interesting is that the theory that I suggested of how and when statues were made, that is, at the beginning, they're not really being moved, they're just being carved and stood up at the quarries. Then they're being moved out a little bit out onto the roads, and finally they're going out onto the coast. When they go out onto the coast, the statues are smaller timbers would have been okay. At the point when the Europeans first arrive, there's 150 or so statues still standing up, but many around the coast have fallen. And I suspect what's happening is that over the centuries, statues are going out and being stood up. Then gradually there are fewer and fewer trees, and the number of statues they're able to take out gradually falls off. So as they naturally fall over, which they're going to do, at the beginning, statues going out are able to more or less replace the statues that fall. But in time, they've got less timber, they're not moving so many statues out, and so in time, 4 or 5 statues fall over, only one goes out to replace them. And so by the time the Europeans arrived, there are few statues going out and many have fallen. And so you're beginning, you don't have to have this, they don't all have to have been pushed over and fallen over at the same time. I think it's just a gradual decay that happens once the timber is running out and you can't replace them on the scale that they were originally created.
One last thing I want to ask you about. I know you have to go soon, and there's so much more we could talk about. Yeah, you talk about at the point where Europeans came and the first missionaries came.
Yeah,
they did see some sort of ritual activity still being enacted. They saw something involving a larger than life-size straw figure being placed atop a cairn. They saw this from their ship. So what do you think that represented? What was that about?
Well, again, it goes back to what I was saying, that we look at the island today and we see all these incredible statues, but we have to remember that at the time the statues were being carved, there would have been so much else going on that wasn't made of stone, that doesn't survive today, that we don't see. And these straw figures are clearly part of that. And by the 18th century, I'm suggesting that actually statue carving, if it's happening at all, is happening much more sporadically than it had been in earlier times. Then it may be that there was a greater emphasis on straw figures, which also notably not timber, reeds and grass, that they're able to create, and creating a different focus of their ritual, but still around, as far as we can see from these early records, associated with burial, disposal of the dead. There's a whole pile of other stuff that happens as society recovers, as the island population recovers after the slave race and the diseases. And what happens there is there's an element, of course, of natural regrowth on the island, but also large numbers of people come in from other Polynesian islands, people come in from the South American continent, Europeans come in from elsewhere, and the population regrows fairly rapidly. And by the time the Routledges arrive, there's a bunch of, for about a century, of ritual and activity that's been happening that represents a complete reinvention of island culture. And it starts that century between the first 4 European visits in the 18th century and the slave raids. Although the visits were very brief, only a day or so each one, and left almost nothing on the island, the impact for islanders was phenomenal. That they saw these great ships appear from nowhere across this ocean that for them, for centuries, for generations, had been completely absent of any human life. And I think to a greater or lesser extent, they would have seen these ships as representing gods and come to see them. And they completely reinvented their rituals and religions to, on the one hand, to kind of say to these people, in the same way that happened in the Pacific during the Second World War, with the development of cargo cults, when islanders in the Eastern Pacific wanted Americans to come back with all their wealth and reenacted American soldiers on the island and so on. And on Rapa Nui, what they're doing is they're actually reenacting the visits of these European ships. And Catherine Routledge, astonishingly, actually records rituals in which people dress up as European sailors and create out of earth model ships and march around them and stuff. And they're also doubling down on their traditions and their myths and their identity, creating rituals that celebrate these in a particular way, and even inventing a script to write these things down. And that's absolutely unique in the Pacific. So the immediate response to European visits in the 18th century is not loss of identity, it's not destruction of the type that you so often get on Pacific Islands and elsewhere, of course, in the world, around the world. But it's actually almost a strengthening of identity, an expression of astonishing resilience and creativity. And that's on its own, that's a story that needs telling and researching and investigating.
Has that ever been deciphered, Rongo Rongo? The written script?
The script, Rongo Rongo. It's never really going to be fully deciphered. And of course, it's controversial. There are people who dedicate their lives to trying to figure this thing out. And I should say it's engraved into wood, these little sort of hieroglyphic-like little figures. I go along with a guy called Steve Fisher, who interprets the script as a kind of form, a representation of Polynesian creative triads that start with a representation of reproduction, of male gender, and then has one thing and then another. So it's doing things like saying the birds met the fish, gave birth to the sea. The sun met the moon, gave birth to this island. And which is how so much Polynesian creative myths work, with this triad. And it doesn't, unfortunately, for Steve Fisher and people like me who actually believe in this, it doesn't work with all the scripts. But some of the most significant scripts, it's remarkable how you get these triads repeated over and over again across these tablets and staffs.
I thought it was fascinating, too, the connections you drew between tattooing practices and petroglyphs and this written script. It's another case of these cultural continuities passing through all of Polynesia and being expressed in a unique way on Easter Island.
Yeah, Polynesians were great tattooists, and Rapa Nui no less than anybody else. And there were some fantastically complicated tattoos. And indeed, some of the early European observers seeing these tattoos actually described them in terms of script. You know, there was something in these tattoos that was conveying some kind of message. And I think there's a lot of argument, it's quite controversial where this script came from, what the origins of it were. And there's largely two camps. One is that it was inspired by islanders seeing the Spanish expedition, who got islanders to sign a document. And so the islanders saw this document, saw this writing, and they were given pens and said, write here. And so they scribbled on this document. And that then gave them the idea of a script. And the other idea is they invented it entirely by themselves, and it was completely independent. And there's a tendency for people to say that if you argue that it was inspired by the Spanish script, then you're patronizing Polynesians, saying they couldn't have done it by themselves. And personally, I think it's more than likely that it was inspired by the Spanish script. But I don't think in any way that diminishes the power and creativity of the islanders in coming up with their own script. I mean, let's face it, nobody else did. And it's an extraordinary thing. And I think one of the mechanisms for it, and we have to think about how this happened, and one of the mechanisms for it is that I think the technique of carving out these little hieroglyphs in timber is very similar to tattooing. And so they're using a little sharp stone or something like that. And it would have been the same sort of tool that would have been used in tattooing. And maybe they rubbed ink over it so that ink went into the, some kind of paint went into the little indentations in the wood that made them show up well and so on. So I think that the script is something that comes out of a combination of seeing this Spanish writing, the tradition of tattooing and the technology of tattooing, and the explosive Rapa Nui inventiveness that is always there.
That's what's so interesting about your book to me, the cultural continuities that you show and the way you retell this story. Because I mean, this ecocide myth says so much more about us than it does about this place. Yeah. And the idea that the claim that these statues and this culture must have been built by somebody else, that the islanders couldn't have done it or aliens had to have done it, it's so insulting. Like, it betrays such arrogance on the part of outsiders because they couldn't figure it out. So therefore, these people couldn't have done it,
Yes, I just think it's silly. But I mean, the joke is that I think the real story that we strive to understand of Polynesians arriving on these islands and achieving everything they did is so much more interesting. And I think in its own way, it's much more impressive. It's much more impressive.
Oh, so thank you for your time today, Mike. I really loved the book. It's one of my top reads of the year. And there's so much more we didn't touch on. The Birdman, Call to Orongo, and the ceremonial sites. There's so much more for listeners to discover. So I really hope they pick it up. You've given me a far richer understanding of a place that obsessed me as a teenager and a deeper understanding of the Polynesian world.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. And please consider joining my members club on Substack. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com for details.